Welcome to The Week in IndyCar, the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires. We have our friend JR Hildebrand getting ready for another crack at the Indianapolis 500. How are you this fine morning in Colorado, and how's a cup of coffee you just brewed?
I'm good, man. I'm an espresso guy, so.
Well, that's...
It's a mini cup of coffee.
Yes, well, we've already started off very Californian here. So, JR, what's the rest of your week going to be like, since we're speaking on a Tuesday morning? We've got the GP of Indy kicking off here this weekend, and then practice starts next week. Are you full packing and preparing mode, or is it last couple days uninterrupted with Mrs. Hildebrand? What's your week like?
Yeah, this year, I mean, kind of no matter whether I've been doing, the GP or not over the last bunch of years. Obviously, last year, full-time is always a busy time of the year, just getting everything sorted out. So my week this year is, I was actually supposed to be in Indianapolis today for an appearance or event. I was supposed to be in with some kids at a school, and got canceled, so I actually flew out to Indy and found out that it got canceled once I got there yesterday, and just flew back home, which was pretty awesome. So I got an extra day. I drive out to Indy every year from Colorado, so
how long does that take?
We split it up into 2 days. It's a little bit of a, I've had to do it in one day before, and it's like a major haul because it's 1,100 miles or something. So we definitely, I got some practice in for when I do the Cannonball Run, at some point down the road. But so my wife is originally from Oklahoma City, or just outside of Oklahoma City. We drive down there, drop the dog off, and then swing back up to Indy. So I'll do that Wednesday, Thursday this week. Be in town in Indy on Friday, and be ready to rock and roll beginning next week.
I love it. What do you guys drive? Do you take the old Caddy, or?
I always think if I had a little bit more time, I would sort out a tow vehicle and drag the Coupe de Ville out there, just because that always seems like it'd be awesome, but it never ends up being super practical. Road trips in old cars that the fuel gauge doesn't work properly is I've done it before, and it's not the most relaxing thing. So we'll jump in the CTSV and load all our stuff in the back and be on our way.
CTSV, you got my heart there already. Well, let's actually talk about a couple of MP podcast items up front, and then we're going to jump into a whole bunch of great IndyCar stuff, and you, as usual, have drawn a ton of excellent questions, so that I'm looking forward to that. So we have our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com that continue to do a pretty cool thing, JR, and sending off either a T-shirt or a mug of my little cartoon character and whatnot to whomever asks my favorite question of the week. So we'll get to that when we kick off questions. But it's been fun seeing folks send back photos of them with my ugly cartoon mug in shirt or whatever form. So it's a trippy thing. I mean, I have to imagine that you, as a long-time IndyCar driver and someone who's been, in the North American spotlight for a while, you're probably not even fazed when you see, a hero card with your face on it, or, a banner or whatever. I can just tell you, as a guy who's essentially spent his career behind the scenes, it's a really bizarre thing to see someone wearing a Marshall Pruett podcast T-shirt.
Man, how awesome!
I'm not complaining.
When I see other people doing it, it's like, yeah, right on.
I know. It's not a complaint. It's a bizarre thing, man. It's just
I hear you.
Just bizarre. The other fun thing, which definitely going to announce today, and we'll get into the finer details here shortly, is back around December, our friends at Bell Racing Helmets USA said, hey, want to do something with the podcast when we get to May, when we get to kicking off everything at Indianapolis. And so they're actually going to be my first of a kind of a new thing, and that being a monthly partner. So we obviously have Cooper Tires. They're my podcast's year-long primary sponsor, primary advertiser, and they make this all possible. With their blessing, they said, hey, it's all good if you want to bring in, one or two more. Let's not crowd things. Let's not do the opening of some other podcasts where you hit play and then you listen to 15 minutes and, hey, and we're also, buy this kind of soup. It'll make you feel good. And, hey, do you have toes? Well, you should put socks on them and buy them from this, and you're just falling asleep drooling on whatever. So we're not going to do that to you. We're not going to throw 20 different ads at you, but we will try and do at least one new partner per month. And so Bell Racing Helmets USA has come on board. So we're actually going to do some pretty cool things, JR. I think 19 of the 34 to 35 drivers entered for the 500. I mentioned 34 to 35 because we'll get to Pietro Fittipaldi and Dale Coyne still needing to fill that. But more than half of the folks that'll be on the entry list for the 500 are Bell users. So we're going to do some cool things this month. We're actually going to do something very different. We're actually going to do a daily podcast. It's not going to be the week in IndyCar. I guess it's going to be the day in Indy 500. I'm not sure what we're going to call it, but we're going to do a daily wrap-up at the end of the day. It's not going to be super long. I know I'm going to be bugging you at least to come join us. We're going to try and do all of these in Bell's garage and Gasoline Alley, but it'll be 10 or 15 minutes. And obviously, Robin and I will be writing about this, what's happening each day, doing our end-of-day videos as well. I figured, well, let's also do something podcast form, because I keep hearing from a lot more people, JR, like, hey, my drive to work is a half hour or 15 minutes or whatever. And
it's so easy.
These podcasts are just, something that I keep hearing folks say, hey, it helps pass the time. So I figure even though we're going to be hitting you with words on racer.com and videos on racer.com, we'll also try and serve up, like I said, 10, 15-minute end-of-day wrap-up. Going to try and bring up whether it's different drivers, engineers, whomever. I don't know. But just try and bring a little bit of flavor from the track. So that's going to be something new. We're also going to do a round table at Bell's shop there in Speedway, and still planning on that, but I know they're hoping to have 4 or 5 drivers there and do some pretty cool giveaways to access to come in and watch that live. So anyways, man, just it's kind of fun to see, for me at least, this little thing that I do with my podcast. It's the one and only thing that's mine. Everything else I do work related is for a client, so just kind of fun to see it getting a little bit of legs, and having someone like Bell Helmets USA wanting to come in and say, hey, let's have some month of May fun. So with all that stuff aside, tell us a little bit about Dreyer and Reinbold Racing. Not only your return to that team, JR, for the month of May here, but you guys are going to be in an interesting situation, right? It's not as if you will have done a couple of races with this new Universal Aero Kit, either road course, short oval, super speedway trim. You guys are going to be turning up and really having to mash the throttle on the education side to learn what it wants and needs. Tell us a little bit about the engineering team you and your teammate Sage are going to have, and are there any shortcuts that a partner like Chevrolet or otherwise can maybe help you, do some advanced learning so you're not, burning the first 4 or 5 days just trying to figure out what you have?
Yeah. Well, the engineering team at Dreyer, well, first, I'm super excited to be running with these guys. I know from driving around Sage over the last bunch of years in practice, but especially in the races, which is, where everybody really does have it just like all on the table. Everybody's on the same, fuel strategies and, tires and all that kind of stuff, that car has been bad fast.
Oh, yeah.
And, he's been able to do a lot with it. So, was excited to be able to put together, and the engineering squad that we've got for this year is, the team's, I think, always been really good at sort of the engineering by committee. Jeff Britton is the primary on the, he's like full-time guy on the 24 car. He sort of acts as like technical director for the team. Got a couple of great assistants. The primary on my car is going to be Chase Kaufman, who was Jeremy Millis's assistant engineer at, I actually worked with him back at Panther.
Oh, wow.
He came from, I think he started out working at Panther, I think, as on an internship from IUPUI.
Wow.
And so he and I were both, sort of rookies in the mix. He was doing data and moved up the ranks a little bit there, went over to Sarah Fisher, went with Jeremy to ECR when that all kind of merged. I was looking forward to, when I knew Jeremy was going to take off last year, all of this happened kind of like before my deal came together, but Jeremy took off. I was sort of angling for Chase to be my primary at the time, heading into my full-time season last year at ECR. He ended up getting like a killer job offer to go work for Cruise, which is General Motors' autonomous vehicle development arm. So he's been doing that, living in Arizona, but helped the team last year, and he's going to be coming back out to work full-time on my car. So I'm really excited about it. I've been in touch a lot over the last couple of years, and certainly in recent months about all kinds of stuff. So looking forward to working with him. And Andy O'Gara is going to be my strategist on the stand. Got a bunch of guys that I've worked with before. Brad Larson's my chief mechanic, who was my chief mechanic last year at ECR. So got like really good, really solid group of guys. I think in going through the engineering and kind of the setups and what we've been doing, there's some things that are different and things that I'm looking forward to getting in and trying. Obviously, Sage being there, him and Jeff together will be a good benchmark just for as we look at the aero kit, just for trying to figure out, okay, apples to apples compared to last year, what do they feel like are the differences? It's hard for me to getting into a car with a different setup and the new kit. It'll be a little bit more difficult to figure out just with their setup compared to their setup in the past, what's different. So that'll be, super helpful to have a set of teammates that have been there and done it before. And to your question about, what are the other things that we can do to get up to speed, we've all been, I personally have been putting in some time, but, as a group, we've been, getting on the horn to kind of pester the Pratt & Miller and Chevy guys as much as we can, just to try to figure out, kind of what are the general trends. Pratt & Miller, obviously having been full-time last year and working with ECR over the last handful of years, I know how good those guys are. Obviously, the Ilmor guys as well, but the Pratt & Miller guys on the vehicle dynamics side, it gets in pretty deep into understanding the aero package, understanding the vehicle dynamics, using their tools. I think you'd see that, even the Penske boys are leaning on that stuff, pretty heavily at times. So, there's a lot of information there. A lot of it still for everybody is kind of speculative. Everybody got like a day or a day and some change under their belt last week. So that gives everybody just kind of a general feel for what the car is like. Seems like it sort of matches, the expectations based on all the data and information that we have currently. And, so our job really is to kind of pull everything together, be prepared when we first go out on track to make sure we're not wasting time just, kind of getting things in order and, getting with the program. I feel, for me, I feel it's definitely, it's a little daunting that things are new and we've got one less day of practice. So, if you get a rain day or something like that, it takes away a lot more time kind of on a percentage basis of running the car. But, I know the team's been really well equipped in the past and, I think we got a good group of guys. So for me, we should be ready to go.
Having been there, it was interesting to see both the effects of wind. It was very, very windy on Wednesday during the manufacturer test day. We saw that Tony Kanaan put up a 226 and change. That was with the high boost. And he did that in the morning. It was interesting to see. I mean, you know this, JR. Our listeners will know it now. But when we go from, call it the average boost used in practice and on race day, but when we make that jump to high boost for qualifying weekend and Fast Friday to prepare for it, it's worth on average about 4.5 miles an hour. You could say 5, but round numbers 5, but roughly 4.5 miles per hour. It was very interesting on Wednesday to see that Tony, at the end of lunch, going into the lunch break, was at that 226 and change, which if you looked at the second fastest driver, it was round about 4.5 to 5 miles an hour faster. So it stood out pretty clearly that the manufacturers were trying to do some high boost runs, to do some simulations for qualifying and whatnot, but also you had a lot of folks primarily focusing on race day running per se. And then you move back to Monday, where we had 20-ish, 21 drivers in action there. Then we had the rookies and refreshers the day after, and we had wind, we had perfect conditions, we had everything. We had some drafting going on. It's just interesting to see that this 2018 Speedway Aero kit, which definitely has more drag than the previous model, is still capable of putting up some fairly good speeds, and it will certainly be interesting to see what happens come qualifying, to see if we can get close to that 232 Scott Dixon did last year. I think most people are saying they think 230-ish, maybe a 231 might be possible in optimal conditions, but just nice to see that a totally different approach to aerodynamics at the super speedways is not something that has drastically altered the car's ability to go fast. So I know that's something you appreciate as well. Different mindset, yet more or less same result.
Yeah, I think, when you dig into the nuances of it, it's definitely different. Like you mentioned, I think a lot of people initially thought, with the rear pods and all that kind of stuff, removing all of that stuff, that it would, reduce drag. In fact, it's, increased the drag. Those things actually did a lot to both add downforce and take away drag to clean up the flow over the back of the car. So the cars have more drag this year. The tuning window of the aerodynamics is much smaller, so we've got the difference between kind of max trim and minimum trim, basically like the least amount of drag that you can run, is a much larger, less efficient swing in downforce for a less total amount of drag from kind of one end of the spectrum to the other. So I think you'll see, because the cars have, they're probably kind of maybe similar kind of speeds in race trim. We've basically, for the maximum trim level that we run at Speedway this year, it's a couple 100 pounds less downforce than the last few years, which initially on paper, a lot of us thought, man, we were running that much downforce for a reason, taking away 200 pounds, that's kind of a big step. But then you think back to, the car doesn't have the dome skid on anymore. We're lowering it back down. The car gets more efficient. Center of gravity is lower. Works better. You look back to the numbers that we were at in race trim prior to the dome skid, and we're kind of back in that same range. So basically, when they added the dome skid, we had to run an extra couple 100 pounds worth of downforce just to make the car kind of work properly, because it was all it was a little bit higher up in the air, and CG was higher and less efficient. So I think the expectation is that in race trim, from a downforce perspective, it'll basically feel in the same window as it's been for several years now, maybe back to a little bit more of the pre-aero kit DW12 style of race, but the cars, even at that downforce level, have more drag. So I think that's where you see, you wouldn't normally on a practice day like the open test day see that big of a difference between kind of like the average on your own lap time and or lap speed and the toe speeds that quickly. There was like a big jump. Oh, yeah. Guys running 226 from a maybe 219 or to something like that. So potentially 6-7 miles per hour, I think that's due to the fact that the cars are punching a bigger hole in the air and the effect of the draft is more significant. So I think that's, one of the things that we'll be paying attention to as we do our race running. And, you mentioned in sort of qualifying trim, I don't, I guess at this point I'm thinking it'll be a little bit of a surprise if we see guys going 230, just because it's really hard to shed that much drag off the car, So it'll be interesting once we start getting a little closer, get to Fast Friday, start being able to map out what the conditions over that weekend are going to be. It doesn't make it any less difficult to stick it in the top 9, but I think the general thought, at least from what I've seen, is to expect the cars being a little bit slower than they've been, for sure.
Let's talk a little bit about rather unfortunate circumstance, JR. You might have seen the footage of young Pietro Fittipaldi having his first, big bone-breaking, injury onboarding type event. I mean, you hope as a driver, obviously, that you get to be, get to the end of your career and never have an injury that sidelines you. I don't know if it's better for this to happen while Pietro's still young and 19 or in the middle of his career when he's in his prime. I'm not sure if there's an optimal timing for things. I can tell you that the Dale Coyne Racing team was really, really disappointed with what happened, because they were looking forward to him really being a big contributor to the team. Not saying that their other drivers would not be big contributors as well, but they really love the kid. Just he's a charming little fella, but he's also someone that, despite having limited IndyCar oval experience, does bring actually a fairly solid resume with him from some NASCAR things that he's done. So they were counting on him to be a big part of their success this month. And now they're having to search for a replacement. Let's just talk before we get into some of the search angle.
Yeah.
What's it been like for you, JR, having to deal with injuries at inopportune times in your career? I mean, heck, I remember that media thing at Texas where you damn near blew out your knee and then had to race the rest of the year. I mean, how does stuff like this affect, you as a young driver trying to make your name and knowing that, man, I got to spend some time with a cast on or whatever it is, and I hope I don't lose momentum career-wise once I'm ready to go.
Well, I think, in Pietro's case, I haven't been around him personally, but I can sort of like validate what you say about the team. I remember talking to Jimmy Vassar for a little bit at Long Beach, and he was just talking about how impressed he was that he was kind of as collected as he was, didn't have a big entourage around. As a Fittipaldi, maybe guys weren't totally sure how he would kind of come into the fray, but very serious about his craft and all that kind of stuff. I think, as far as the injury goes, I guess my view it would be that it's much easier to have those things happen while you're on the come up. There's not a lot of expectations for exactly how you're going to be performing at that point. He's built up, I think, a level of sort of credibility and interest that's not going to go away because he's had an unfortunate accident, and certainly just from a physical perspective, much easier to have these types of things happen when you're young, but when you're in your 30s going into your 40s or something, so I think I wouldn't expect from the outside that this has a significant impact on his career trajectory or his opportunities, and certainly Sebastian went through this in a much more significant fashion than I did, or than I have over the years. I've sort of been fortunate to be able to more or less drive through whatever injuries I've had, but you mentioned I raced a season, a little bit more than half a season with a torn ACL in 2011, and then had broken hand last year. So it's just, there are things that you have to kind of deal with and surround yourself with good, physical therapy and doctors and that kind of stuff. I mean, the great thing about being a part of the racing community, certainly I've experienced this as part of the IndyCar community, is, you just have access to like really awesome people to work on these things, and everybody knows there's no like room for interpretation in terms of what your goals are. It's get back in the car as quickly as possible and be healthy and, crank on your rehab and all that kind of stuff. So, I'd expect him to be back sooner than later. And, bummer for everybody involved that it's the timing of it is that he'll end up kind of missing his first chance at the 500, but, I'm sure he'll be back sooner than later.
So a couple other quick angles on this to hit JR before we move on to one more topic and then Q&A. So I happened to text with Pietro a couple days ago, and he said, look, I'm going to do everything I can to get back ASAP, and that's the exact mindset you want to hear, because you can go one of two ways. If you are still young and you get hurt, like seriously hurt, you're gonna take it one of two ways. You're either going to question whether this is the smartest thing to do with one's life, or B, you're going to use it as crazy motivation to just go psycho in rehab and everything else to get back immediately and not let it become a thing. It's awesome to hear that this kid who's pretty mellow, fairly softly spoken. Just good to hear that the fire is burning even brighter with him. Spent some time on the topic of who might replace him. It's a lot of moving parts there. I spent some time Sunday morning at Mid-Ohio speaking with Sebastian Saavedra, who in an article I mentioned he would appear to be in pole position, if they want to be, to jump into that ride, because Dale Coyne, from some things that I've heard from folks who tend to be knowledgeable, have said this truly is not an easy thing in terms of, well, who do we need to drop in? It's who can we find that is skilled but also brings a budget. And the budget part, from everything I've heard, and I've heard it multiple times now, that's non-negotiable. So, ringing up Fernando Alonso and saying, hey, Fred, got a free seat, or Lewis Hamilton, or, there's a lot of folks, and it's been good fun as well, JR, watching, looking at folks on social media saying, well, how about this guy, and how about, he or she, and you go, these are
never quite that simple.
Yeah, these are all great ideas, don't get me wrong, but there's the part two. Do they have a budget? So I know that AFS Racing, Gary Peterson, and Sebastian Saavedra, I think I can say this without betraying any confidences. Their conversations taking place. I think anyone who knows them and knows the game knew that conversations would be taking place. But here's the interesting part, JR, and this could be wrong, but again, these are things that I've heard that aren't quite solid enough for me to write about yet, but I do believe this could be shaping the conversation. So with this number 19, Dale Coyne Racing Honda, it's being shared between Zachary Clayman DeMello and Pietro Fittipaldi. Pietro was scheduled to be in the car for the GP of Indy, the 500, and then come back for Texas, and there are going to be some other primarily oval races on his end. Well, with Pietro out for these 2 rounds in May at least, and then some more coming up after that, I've heard that since he's not going to be in the car, and you have 2 ways that things tend to get paid for, right, Jared, when it comes to a driver like Pietro who is bringing some sponsors with him.
Right.
They either, the payment method could happen a couple ways, could be lump sum all up front. That's a bit of a rarity. The more common approach is some sort of regularly scheduled payments. And
you're forgetting the promise of a lump sum down the road somewhere.
Oh yeah, that is true. Oh man, boy, when
it still happens, man.
When we get to the final race, boy, are you going to have a sweetheart of a check waiting for you. Hey, we can't find that guy. Where'd he go? From some things that I've heard, they haven't been, verified by multiple sources yet, but it sounds somewhat accurate. knowing that Pietro was meant to be in the car, multiple months, multiple races throughout the year. I've heard that the payment schedule plan is what was in place, and that since it looks like he's not going to be in the car for the next, for this month, next month possibly, a couple things open up here, right? Well, you're going to be missing out on I think he was doing 7 races, something like that. Well, if you're going to be missing out on almost half your season, will there be a genuine reason to return for just a couple, since this plan's kind of been derailed by injury? And second, well, if that's the case, and we're not going to be driving, then the question of the payments coming in for events that we're not doing, well, that's obviously not going to go forward. So it creates an interesting scenario where we're not just talking about trying to find someone to drive the car for the GP or the 500 or Texas or some of the other ovals. It's, so could Coyne be talking to drivers and saying, yeah, we're not just talking about month of May now. I'd like to, what I would really rather do is sign you up for all the ovals that Pietro's going to miss.
These events,
and that then changes the dynamic, doesn't it? Because it's one thing if I said, hey, Marshall Pruett, he's going to hop in that car for the 500, and I go talk to a sponsor and they say, great, we're in for whatever that dollar amount is for the 500. Then you hear, okay, well, that's fine, but we also want money for Texas and that complicates things, right? Because as I have ambulances and fire trucks going on behind me here, that changes the dynamic, because just getting a sponsor for the Speedway, JR, that might actually be the easiest part, but that wouldn't necessarily fulfill the entire obligation if that's what the team is going after.
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, the problem is just the timing of it all, right? Like, you got to fill the first, hole here in a hurry, and that might not leave you with enough time to work out the best option. Your best option in the short term may not be your best long-term option, and at some point here within the week, you get to a point that you don't have a choice. So I think that's definitely the tricky part of this for sure. I wouldn't be shocked if Pietro, depending on what the diagnosis is in terms of how long he's going to be out, he's doing a partial season to start with. Wouldn't be shocked if he's trying to get back into the car, get back into an IndyCar before the end of the year, if he, has the option to do that based on his injuries and recovery and all that kind of stuff. But one way or the other, whether it's just a couple of events here in May, or it's these two and then Texas and maybe one other, or, whatever it is, it's a tricky spot for Dale to be in. And additionally tricky because you want to keep that car running full time. A big part of these conversations these days is about, being able to maintain kind of the leader circle commitment. And, I've been in this, I was in this conversation with the ECR guys, a couple of years ago. We were trying to get full time, and, it was maybe going to be partial seasons getting put together and all this kind of stuff. And, just as a group, we weren't all paying enough attention to the math for, how much you actually needed once you were, basically once you get to leader circle, it almost offsets the cost of like 3 or 4 events potentially, because, that's sort of underwriting a part of your full season commitment. So, there's a lot of things in play. I definitely don't envy team owners in these positions, because they're just, it's a tricky sort of road to navigate. But, I'm imagining, particularly with there being, a bump day qualified entry list, you got to get somebody in the car that you trust can sort of make it happen here. Obviously, there's kind of an immediate financial hole to fill. To your point, usually easier to make that happen for Indianapolis than it is for,
Iowa.
Let's say you need a couple of whatever, 3 or what, I'm making this up, but let's say it's $200,000 or $300,000 or something to kind of like fill the gap at Indy. That's easier to do than even if it's just $200,000 or $250,000 for Texas, right? So tricky spot to be in, and I think we'll kind of get a feel for what the long-term outlook is looking like based on how they make decisions here in the short term.
It is pretty insane to think about how a 5-second accident in Belgium can turn things completely, on a team's head and add so many angles to consider. And there's one other thing to throw in here too, and I've heard this mentioned as a fallback. You cracked open the topic of leader circle, that being the two full-time Dale Coyne entries, the number 18 driven by Sebastian Bourdais, the number 19, as we mentioned, shared by Fittipaldi and Clayman de Mello. Well, those two are, they signed a contract that said, we will be at every race with these two cars, with these two entry numbers, and in exchange, IndyCar gives them, a little over $1 million per entry. And so I've heard that if they fail to come to terms with a suitably skilled and funded driver for that fourth car, they could indeed go forward with three. And what would likely then happen is either Connor Daly, who is one of their month of May drivers, or Pippa Mann as well. One of them numerically would be shifted over to the 19 car, so that while they would be down one entry, the number 19 would satisfy its leader circle obligations. So we would essentially have a number change, and I think, more or less that's it. At the same time, again, worst case scenario here, where if they were to drop down to three, you would then also have a fourth car worth of mechanics and engineers and otherwise that I don't know if they would be truly out of work, or if they would be reapportioned to, help with the other three entries, just add some, extra skill and talent there. So anyways, man, just amazing how this one thing at a sports car race in Belgium over the weekend has just set so many dominoes in motion.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So what do we take away from this? Don't race in Belgium before the Indy 500, boys and girls. That's the definite lesson.
Definitely race in Belgium before the Indy 500. That's awesome.
Yay! Well, let's move
Don't
into...
get hurt racing in Belgium before the Indy 500.
Oh, that's going to be the new requirement, folks. Let's delve into one other topic before we get to Q&A. And I spoke about this a couple times last week on some end of day videos, and I have a feeling we're going to talk about it a lot more throughout the month of May, JR, and that is having moved from the 2017 manufacturer aero kits produced by Chevy and Honda that had seemingly a million little bits and pieces and bobs and things you could add and remove to give you different aerodynamic results, whether it was downforce, drag, moving center of pressure, fore and aft. There's so many little things that you could do, also big things, right? The Chevys in particular, side pod configuration. Even, we'd seen splitting with one side pod configuration on the left, different than the right. On the rear wheel pods, sometimes would have the little upper wing element there on one side, not the... I mean, there's a lot, again, tunability like you wouldn't believe. And now we move into this universal aero kit where you don't really have a lot of that anymore. You don't have the ability to put on bolt wickers onto every surface imaginable. You have far fewer choices, aero-wise, to really get the car to a place that, maybe you could through 10 or 20 other means last year. Tell me a little bit about that mindset-wise, JR, knowing that you have fewer things to really dial in perfection maybe than you did before. And second, tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear spoken of very frequently because of this, and that is now having to optimize mechanical setup maybe more than ever because aero tuning isn't going to get you as far as maybe it once could.
Yeah, I mean everything you said is exactly right. Particularly being in the Chevy camp, every year at Indy, with the aero kits, you can drive yourself nuts trying to figure out exactly what you're running, and then you're watching everybody else go out, and, everybody was always on something totally different. Like, different teams have different philosophies in terms of what's working and what's not based on their own wind tunnel data, and, the differences in efficiency and downforce and drag between all of these little bits and pieces was really small, and had a number of overlapping, sort of configurations in terms of where they were at in the like L over D scale, and
that would be lift over drag.
Yeah, and like sometimes, I think basically at ECR we sort of migrated towards one philosophy of what of those kind of overlapping configurations was better, that was different than the Penske guys. It was kind of like the whole thing was a lot of your month, frankly, as you built up to qualifying, was just kind of making sure that we had our head on straight and we were experiencing the effect on track that the numbers were suggesting that we were going to get to, and all this kind of stuff. Fortunately for us, particularly last year, we were, I think, really, really good at that. But this year it's really back to kind of pre-Aero Kit DW12 style of downforce trim. So basically, the way that the scale works is that you'll take wing out until you can't take any more wing out, and then you'll transition, if you can, if the car still has enough grip, to going to trimmed diffuser sidewalls, and then to removed diffuser sidewalls. And that those two steps are super inefficient at the very end of the scale. So that's kind of like if the conditions are good and everything's solid and you're feeling good for 4 laps, then you can squeeze a little bit of added performance for like potentially a significant amount of grip loss by going to those diffuser sort of options. And that even at that, back in 2014, like pre-Aero Kit, you could run asymmetrically trimmed sidewalls. You could do the trimming kind of like yourself, I think. So you had some different options in terms of how the sidewall, edges of the diffuser were worked out. This year it's very simple. Either you run them both trimmed and everybody, runs the same amount, or you have to remove both of them. To your point, what that all kinds of end up leading to is basically the downforce trim levels are much more simple and straightforward. There's not all of this other crazy stuff. You're not going to see guys, adding and removing body panels or parts or, whatever. And it'll, I think being fast in qualifying will be kind of even more reliant than in years past on, just straight up mechanical drag. So, gearbox and uprights and, all that kind of stuff, that just allows the car to basically roll down the straightaway more freely. And the mechanical setup of the car, how much grip can you build into it to try to chase those last maybe handful of trim steps, and can you keep the car from losing speed via scrub and tire degradation over 4 laps? Those things have definitely been a part of qualifying over the last few years, but I would say just tuning to the right aero level has been more significant in the last couple of years than sort of tuning to and optimizing the right aero level, whereas this year it'll be coming down to more of some of those kind of more traditional factors, I think.
One of the reasons, dear listeners of the Week in IndyCar and the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires, that I try and have folks like JR Hildebrand on. Last week we had Charlie Kimball on. I definitely enjoy when we have guests on and try and have folks like yourself, JR, who can tell us great things about being a race car driver and answer those questions, but also make us smarter. And that's not taking a jab at anyone else doing any other podcasts or radio or whatever, but it's one thing to talk about stuff. It's another thing for me to go away going, cool, I know more, I'm smarter, or in my case, less dumber. So, good call. And also, I really didn't think of it, but I guess had my pea brain fired up, I would have realized that, now I get why so many people have sent in questions today referring back to 2011 and you and Charlie Kimball, because I've had Kimball and Hildebrand on back to back. Yeah, so fun there. Well, hey, let's get into some Q&A, my man. And as I mentioned at the outset, we start off every week where I pick my favorite question from the previous week. So our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com can send the person either a T-shirt or a mug. And since I know that one of my favorite questions this week is going to be a technical one, I'm going to pick one from last week that wasn't technical, and that's going to go to Tom Cottle. And his question of, hey, fellas, I would like to know if Robin could tell a couple of funny Bobby Unser stories. Impression expected, too. And Robin certainly didn't disappoint and did his spot-on Uncle Bobby impression. So, Tom, that certainly my favorite question from last week. So send me a little DM here on the Marshall Pruett Podcast Facebook page. Give me your address, your email address, and tell me whether you want a shirt or a mug. And if it's a shirt, what size? And our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com will get you hooked up. I would also suggest, and this is just a suggestion, there's no money, by the way, exchanged here between me and Toronto Motorsports. They're just good friends and good people. They're the ones who do those awesome cartoons for each IndyCar race, JR. And anyways, they're good folks. So, look, if they're going to give my listeners some free swag, the least I can do is suggest folks check out their website and at least get stickered up, man. All right there. And I'm hoping someone asks about your choice of car number for the month of May in our Q&A here, and if not, I will be sure to do so. But let's go with the first question actually filed, and that was from Gabe Argenta. He said, I'd like both of your thoughts on this. Who do we have to bribe to get the Indy GP to run the banking in the final turn, oval turn 1, like Formula 1 did, and even the Grand Am Series used to? Or why shouldn't they do it? So, I think we know who to bribe, JR. I just don't know if you and I have enough money to actually pull that. Well, I could hold Doug Bowles upside down and, do something like that. But
run the banking, Doug.
Do you like that idea?
I do. I mean, I think the last little section is always a little kind of tricky. The tough thing with the track, I mean, let's just be totally honest. The tough thing about it is that because it's built on the inside of the speedway, there's just no elevation change. I think they've done a really good job kind of tweaking it over the years, and like that kind of that infield section's definitely gotten more interesting. It's a little bit faster. The cars have to twitch and move a little bit more to get through. What is it? Kind of like 7, 8, 9, or whatever that is in the middle of the infield by the mounds. I think anything we can do to make it a little bit more intriguing. It's obviously got a long front straight as it is. The cars over the last couple of years, even just following guys close coming onto the front straight, the way that we open up onto the front straight now can be pretty tough. So the one thing that I think would be interesting about using the banking outside of the fact that you would just be totally hauling the mail going down to turn 1, which is always sort of cool if you have the opportunity to do it, is that you create a really long section to be able to draft up and get by somebody, which I think is always, given that, we're kind of splitting hairs on whether one corner or another really makes the track, more interesting or whatever, that could be an interesting kind of win just as far as the event itself goes. So, I'd be game for certainly getting some cars out there and giving it a shot one of these days. Maybe next time they have a test day, they can test out some of the other configurations, because they've got the whole MotoGP section that we run it backwards to how countercourse to how the MotoGP guys run it, but their last handful of turns before they dump back out onto the chicane onto the front straightaway, which is our sort of after turns 3 and 4, they would stay tight to the right there. There's a couple extra corners, whereas we go through that high-speed chicane onto the back straight. There's some different places that they could change its configuration, add and subtract distance and stuff like that. I'd be game for a little bit of a mix-up here for the GP course.
I think the other question we should ask, which team and driver could we bribe going into, say, opening practice on Friday, or how's this, one of the practice sessions, to throw in some extra tall gears, at least, on the top end, and just intentionally blow the final corner complex to go counter course in turn 1 and see what kind of top speed.
I think the best guy to talk to about it is Mario in the 2-seater, to be honest with you.
Yes. Yeah, that's
Mario would make it happen.
Yeah.
No sweat.
And
nice bottle of wine.
Oh, Mario doesn't need a dang thing. And the thing is he would want Marco's car. He wouldn't want the 2-seater. He'd want to go do it, And if he,
give me a fresh set of reds.
I mean, Marco's been wearing that tribute helmet, so if he played it right, just rolled out while strapped into the car, folks might not even know, other than potentially his speed at the end of the session. So I won't make any comments as to whether I think Mario would be faster or slower.
Easy.
So, tacked on to Gabe's question, Vinny Taibbi said, hey, what's your take on the Indy GP for a season finale? And I would say, Vinny, because we've heard this thrown around, we're not sure if Sonoma is going to continue to be the finale after this season. Heard this thrown around. I'll tell you this, JR. I would say no chance, no way, if it were a day race. Because optics matter, and that Indy looks absolutely empty with 100,000 people in it.
Yeah, you're right.
So if it was a night race, which would effectively mask the lack of hundreds of thousands of people there, then I would love the idea. But if it was a day race, it's the exact opposite of what IndyCar needs right now, which would be to look weak and unimportant at its, effectively the track that made it what it is. So that would be my only concern.
I think you're right, and I think that, for Sonoma, for as much as it ends up being a little bit of a parade in terms of the way the race itself actually plays out, it has, the way that the race has gone, because the track itself is just so difficult to get right on a day-to-day basis, even over the race weekend. I've been there a bunch of times, and I think it's the track that any team outside of Penske seems to have it dialed in. Like, you're always kind of, at times, like, throwing darts in the dark, trying to figure out, like, what is this place requiring of the car and driver to, like, work properly today, right now, with the wind direction this way, and, like, the, ambient temp like this. We've had Scott Dixon and Montoya finishing the season tied a couple of years ago. It's made for some drama, despite the fact that the actual race itself is not always highly dramatic. And to your point, it is really important for the series to be able to end on a note where everybody that's involved in the series, the sponsors, the team sponsors, the teams themselves, can kind of like end the thing on a little bit of a high note where everybody's looking forward to getting back at it the next season. And so I think from that perspective, it's not to say that sponsorship value is the only thing that matters, but having a good event definitely matters at the end of the season. And I think running at Indy is interesting from that perspective because it is obviously the home of what made the sport what it is, in the speedway. I guess to your point, it remains to be seen whether the road course as a standalone event can really be that, hallmark type of deal. It sort of never really was for F1. It came and went for MotoGP. It's hard to sort of fathom that that's the solution, but I agree with you. I mean, I think however it worked out, even if it was just running it in the middle of the season, it would be interesting just to know whether the draw is different when it's touted as its own standalone event. And maybe if it is, I've always loved the idea of doing a night race. I think doing a night race on the Speedway would be really rad. But, you'd have to play with some of those factors, I think, even to have an idea of whether that's a reasonable solution or not.
Got some good questions, JR, on Twitter. We usually get most of our questions in on the old MP podcast Facebook page, but I want to jump over to Twitter here, and if you have the willingness or the ability, we might go into overtime a little bit, just because we've got we've had a bunch of really good questions come in.
Try to keep my answers tight.
Yes. Don Davis, he says, I have to wonder, with all the wingdings and doodads gone with the Universal Aero Kit 2018, is there less of a need for the Aero screen now? Please don't get me wrong, I'm 100% in favor of this device. That's an interesting point. I don't know if I'd heard that one raised, because we don't have as many things to get knocked off and potentially impact a driver's helmet, but it doesn't mean there aren't things that, doesn't mean there are no things that could get knocked off. What do you think?
Well, I guess I would, my personal view of the movement towards the aero screen, head protection, whatever, is that, we are in the process. I'll say in my opinion, we should view ourselves as being in the process of working our way towards something that can deflect a left front upright assembly.
Which is a heavy piece. That is.
Yeah, which the aero screen in its current configuration, we don't know. Maybe it would effectively do that in certain situations, and that would be a huge win. We're sort of talking about it that the expectation is more, glancing stuff off of it, parts of the front wing or, things like that. Body work, as opposed to a big, heavy piece of metal. And so, with that being said, I just think that in the big scheme of things, we should be looking at this as something that is a continuous development towards something that is actually meaningful to reduce the risk of errant debris at a level that could kill a driver. And that I would say in open wheel racing right now, regardless of what the traditional view of what an open wheel car looks like or should be or whatever, that is basically, from talking to guys that are not open wheel drivers, I know this to be fact, guys that you would love to see driving an open wheel car. The fact that the cars go as fast as they do, the fact that you might have an incident like Sebastian last year at Indy is actually, those aren't the things that keep guys from racing in the Indy 500 or driving an IndyCar. The thing that keeps guys from taking that more seriously, or, and the things that, frankly, I think as IndyCar drivers, that we think about in terms of where we should be trying to go, is the fact that there is still just this, you could it completely out of your own control possibility that something happens, like what happened to J-Dub.
Yeah.
And we are all, obviously we're all doing this having assessed and accepted the risk that this is just dangerous and the cars are going super fast and you're going to have things happen that you can't react to, and all that kind of stuff. There's an inherent level of trust that we place in the other drivers that we're racing against and the teams and the crews and, all that kind of stuff. But, this is something that is just kind of out of anybody's control and can happen at a moment's notice. So from my perspective, the fact that the cars at some point have more or less stuff that could fly off of them, that's better than not, I think, just for the sake of having less debris on a, global scale. It causes less cautions because you have less debris. But that should have no impact on our, sort of progression towards at least exploring mechanisms to, add that little bit of extra, reduce that kind of peak risk, basically, of what we're doing. And it's my view entirely that if we can reduce that peak risk, then, you could actually sort of increase the average risk of how fast the cars go and the way they race and doing all that kind of stuff. Right now, we're sort of boxed into a corner that none of those things can change, until we address sort of the elephant in the room.
The good old elephant. Let's move up to a question from John Sable, who we can always count on for asking pretty sharp things. And this isn't specific to you, but it's an interesting topic. It says it's early, but Pato O'Ward looks like the clear favorite in Indy Lights this year. If he goes on to win the title, gets that $1 million check from Mazda to advance, says, is there space for him full-time at Andretti Autosport? What happens to Colton Herta? Does he move up? Does Steinbrenner become a satellite Andretti team? Interesting, right? Because if you think of Andretti Autosport, team you know very well, JR, having done great things there in your Mazda Road to Indy career, they are 4 cars full-time. They're 6th for the month of May. We know that with young George Steinbrenner, the 15th or whatever exactly he is numerically, he's expressed an interest saying, hey, after a couple years in lights with Colton, we want to move up to IndyCar with him. So in that scenario, we could be at 5 next year. Whether that's 5 under the same tent, or as John mentioned, trying to do a little bit of a satellite, with a separate operation, I'm not totally sure. But then you think about Pato, who's driving for Andretti, could certainly be, the champion this year. And as someone who's been a part of the Andretti ladder, the goal would obviously be to move up with them if possible. But you know what it's like, having done great thing in lights, and then, well, my debuts with Dreyer and Reinbold, and then Panther, and so maybe you're the perfect guy to talk about. If you can't continue up the ladder to the big show with the team you're with on the ladder system, is that something to be concerned about, or not so much?
I think it's certainly something you aim to do, and so, but you obviously only have so much power over how that works. I mean, for me, it was a, full house when I graduated out of Indy Lights. I did some testing for, it was Andretti Green at the time, in my, year in between the two, basically. Ended up getting a chance to fill in, and after Mike Conway's unfortunate accident at Indy at Dreyer and Reinbold, and then, made my way into the series full-time kind of via a less direct route that way. I think you got to kind of, at this point, the cars are all, teams are also, very capable. You see what AJ Foyt Racing has done this year, really turning it around, bringing some speed, and you get the right engineering group, and you get the right kind of group of people around you. You can move up, and it can be sort of an unfamiliar environment. I think that the Steinbrenner situation, I think, is probably the most interesting part of this conversation, frankly, just because you've got to figure that they have the means to expand and grow. The satellite teams have not typically been super successful as satellite teams.
Yeah.
So that's maybe not something that you would, I don't know, like that's a tricky thing to kind of invest in, I think, but that I think as the year goes on and we sort of see how Colton continues to do, that's probably the most interesting thing to be looking at, I would say, right now. And for, Pato, like, wherever he, if he gets a shot, you kind of got to take it, right? I mean, you want to be able to move up, and you got to be aware of kind of being in the right type of situations and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of talent, even within the teams across the board these days. So I think given an opportunity, chances are you should take it rather than kind of waiting for the exact right scenario to put itself together.
If again, with all these hypotheticals, if you were to win, if you got that money and you had other sponsors to go with, obviously sticking with Andretti would be a great thing. There's also a part of him that says that if all those things happen and Andretti is not an option, Coyne popped into my head as a perfect destination for him as a younger, well, I shouldn't say younger, but as a smaller challenger brand within the paddock. I think Pato being a great kid, but he is just fiery as heck. And I don't mean like as a bonehead, but just like this kid wants to just destroy. And I love that. So I just think him at Coyne would certainly bring a different kind of competitive flavor. Sebastian is as hard-nosed as you come, completely refuses for things to not be right, and will push no matter whether you like it or not, whether it ruffles your feathers or not. He is 100% about success at all times. I also think having this, really fired up young buck, like, come on, let's go, it might bring some even more crazy dynamic there. So,
Yeah.
anyways, but I think that kid is in store for some pretty good things. But you could also say that about a lot, Colton Herta as well, Santi Arusha, Aaron Telitz. Indy Lights might not have a big car count this year, but obviously grid size has nothing to do with whether there's a bunch of talent stacked towards the front, and there certainly is. So that's a good thing. Let's move on to Josie Towers, at Girl in Black on the tweeters. Says, I would love to hear about your experience setting up the ECR cars, and if that will influence how you set up the number 66 this year. I assume that question's for you, not me.
Yeah. I think, at ECR our stuff had always been pretty fast, and we ended up sort of migrating towards a certain way of looking at the cars. As you do in these things, if you're not putting on the pole, or you're not running in the top 4 at the end of the event, year in and year out, you sort of question whether are there areas that we should be exploring here that are different, whatever. I've certainly kind of had my view of that over the last couple of years, but certainly know the feeling of a car that's fast, and it kind of gotten used to it working a certain way and looking for certain things. Worked very closely with Ed and with Joseph before that. We all worked together pretty well looking for the same stuff. So anyway, it'll be interesting getting in. Obviously I've seen the setups, and there are some differences for sure, but things that I'm optimistic maybe solve for some of the deficiencies that maybe we couldn't quite solve for, or address them in different ways. So at Dreyer, so I'm just interested to get into it. Definitely knowing how good their car has been in race trim over the last few years, not coming in with the expectation that it needs to change much, just looking forward to kind of getting to work and seeing what we've got once we get on track.
Got one more question we're going to hit on Twitter, and this one, look, we're always willing to be real with folks, right? Steve Wade.
Of course.
Going into next week, are there any teams that you would foresee as being in danger of being bumped? The one-offs are being run out of teams that have shown speed at some point during the season, or in DRR's case, they know how to be successful at IMS. I mean, Steve, I don't know if I would couple teams failing to qualify so much as individual entries, because I don't think we're going to see an entire team. Well, let me rephrase that. Of the multi-car teams, I don't think we're going to see an entire multi-car team fail to make the show, but for some of the single entries, it certainly would be possible. Other quick proviso to throw in is, until we get the Pietro Fittipaldi situation sorted, we don't know if it's going to be one car to be bumped or two to be bumped. How's this from my end? I know that I have heard and received a lot of questions, if not straight-up comments, from IndyCar fans saying, I'm concerned about Carlin. I'm concerned whether they are going to have the ultimate speed come qualifying to stay in the show. I know Juncos Racing, for example, a one-car team with a rookie in Kyle Kaiser, is a team that might stand out as one to be concerned about, looking at the overall experience and talent spread across most of the field, JR. I'd also say that one thing Kyle has shown is he's pretty darn good on ovals, and he also has a veteran engineer in Tom Brown, who we could say his specialty, engineering-wise, is ovals. So that might be one that actually surprises instead of falls into the trap of, a young driver, et cetera, one-car team. Could they be on the bubble? Are there any others that stand out? I mean, I've had some folks say, Pippa Mann might be in trouble, but then I look at the quality of the Dale Coyne cars in general. And
they were pretty darn good.
I think that's... I don't want to make any boasts here, but they would appear to be bump-proof as an organization. But are there any without, we're not picking on anybody, but ones where you go, ooh, they might have to work harder to stay in this year, since at least one or two folks are going to go home?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my breakdown of it would be, first, it sort of remains to be seen whether Honda or Chevy has the edge. So that will that typically plays a role, at least, in kind of how all this plays out. One manufacturer or the other at the 1.4 boost level, 1.4 bar boost level, qual boost, will probably just be a little bit better, which either kind of helps its teams, less competitive teams, less high performing in qualifying trim teams, raise their game a little bit to try to, pull themselves out of that bubble zone, or it'll happen the other way around. So that, I think, will probably have some impact on what's going on. From there, I think, we talked about this earlier, a lot of it does come down to just like, can you get the cars to handle well over 4 laps? Preparation plays a huge role in being fast at Indy. Like, if the car rolls off the truck and it just goes down the straightaway fast, like, that helps a lot. And that's something that, teams will pay a high, a tremendous amount of attention to. I think, frankly, that's sort of just on the prep part of it, that maybe hurts, teams that are racing full-time as new teams a little bit. Just you don't have quite as much time. You don't have the bandwidth to be doing all of that prep ahead of time. So to your point, I'm making no guesses in terms of who's going to be, in trouble, like on the outside looking in. But I think, thinking that Carlin and Juncos are in that consideration, I would say based on nothing other than just the fact that they're new full-time teams, they're having to figure all of this stuff out all at once. That doesn't tend to lend itself to being super well prepared when you show up at Indy. And kind of depending on how those two things shake out, manufacturer competitiveness and whether or not that, just the question of bandwidth in prep plays a role. Just kind of comes down to, like, every once in a while, every year, there's, a couple of teams that really just start to struggle to put it together, to be able to have the grip and the balance, to be able to trim enough. You start thinking that you got to trim more because you just don't have the speed in the car, and that's like a nasty spiral that you don't want to get into, So any one of those things could kind of play a role. Weird things happen depending on conditions and all that kind of stuff. I mean, but I guess I would say those are the things that I would look for if I'm, trying to kind of map out where it's going to end up.
All right, we've gone into overtime a little bit here. I'm going to jump over and we're going to pick a couple of final questions here on Facebook, the ones that have received the most amount of likes. And I love that system, JR. It's fairly democratic of like, hey, y'all post questions, tell me which ones you like the most, and we'll try to make sure we at least get those if we do have a little bit of limited time. You and the excuses, man. Oh, I've got to go to Indianapolis and be a race car driver. Whatever. All right. This one from Michael Wallace. It didn't get the most likes, but I like it, so I guess I got a little extra voting power here. Hey, Marshall and JR. Question for you, JR. As a driver in the paddock, is everyone mainly friendly there? And also, what happens if one driver genuinely doesn't feel safe with another driver on track?
Ooh, that's a hard-hitting question.
Hey.
I would say, generally speaking, the drivers are all, pretty friendly with each other. You sort of, everybody's a part of, like, the same community, and, you're going through the same stuff, the same kind of grind of the middle of the season and test days and, whatever. Everybody has their periods where it's not going well. Everybody has some successes through the year. So, I would say for the most part, you kind of, you're able to work together and sort of be on good terms with guys over the duration of the season. I would say that it happens pretty rarely that that anybody in particular is really concerned about the safety of driving around other guys. I will say for sure that has happened, though. It tends to be the, kind of like one-off guys when they particularly Indy. You're just dealing with a higher number of dudes and guys that maybe haven't ever raced full-time IndyCar seasons
or nothing to lose. I'm going to the front.
Whatever.
Yeah.
That's definitely frustrating. Those guys usually just hear it straight up. So, there's not like that's not something that's dealt with diplomatically in most cases, and usually that's like pretty effective. So,
have you ever been in a driver's meeting where it popped off, or one driver just decided to rip another instead of doing it face to face? Because I've heard of such things, but I don't know if you've sat in one where like two guys were just throwing down.
I don't know. Usually in the drivers' meetings, it's a little bit more like passive aggressive. That guy that drives the blue and white car, or something. No, I don't know. It's not been like that in kind of recent years. I don't feel like too much. Some guys, you definitely see it pop up on social media and stuff like that every now and again. But I guess I would say among the actual drivers, there's not like a in person at the track. Either in drivers meetings or whatever, when you're walking out to practice or what have you. There's rarely kind of altercations from that perspective that are at least preemptive. Occasionally after races, you'll have guys that are pissed off at each other, but that doesn't, in my experience at least, that hasn't tended to last very long.
I love it. Let's see. David Zitter-Bart. JR, how do you keep in the racing mindset after going so long without racing in IndyCar? I guess we're talking 500, and just switch on at 227 miles an hour. He says, obviously the Indy GP helps and milk his motivation. He says, do you do a lot of sim work, shifter carts? What do you do to get your brain up to speed?
Yeah, I've done this kind of on and off for a couple of years running Indy. I think Indy is kind of unique just in that you do have time to get familiar. You don't have to be like flat track. It's not like your first time on track. You've got an hour-long practice session, then you're going to qualify 2 hours after that. So from that perspective, it makes it a little bit less stressful, which, as we all know in our own life experiences, sometimes just makes it easier to do anyway. In this particular situation, like, I raced on the last super speedway that anybody else raced on, so like that's not a huge kind of break in the big scheme of things. I would say outside of just kind of being familiar with the steering wheel, and steering wheels are new this year. You guys have talked about that a bunch. Some of the little things like that, little changes. There's not a lot that I'm, if I had run Long Beach or something, that's not actually getting me way more prepped to run at Indy in terms of the feel of the car or any of that kind of stuff than not doing it. So to the question about how do you kind of prepare otherwise, it's really difficult. Even getting on, I can run like the simulator on iRacing or project cars or whatever on my own. Booking time in either HPDs or Pratt Miller simulator as part-time teams is really difficult, frankly. I this year fell into like the weird category of I couldn't do the open test day, and I wasn't going to get a refresher, and I couldn't do the manufacturer test day either. So that somehow worked out really badly. But at the end of the day, I've gotten used to having to just jump in the car, whether it's been at Indy or elsewhere. I think as race car drivers these days, that becomes a part of your skill set, is how prepared can you show up without being like physically prepped in terms of driving the car recently. How mentally prepared can you be to just get in and go? And for me, it's actually something that I kind of enjoy. Like, I enjoy having to get out there and just go. Like, the car doesn't feel right until you're flat out, the car feels like garbage if you're part throttle running around at 210. So it's kind of a like weird, like almost sort of liberating feeling when you first get in the car and you just like pin it and you're up to speed and your mind kind of has to go through a shift and also get up to speed, and then you're in it, and you're rocking and rolling. So that doesn't maybe directly answer the question in terms of what else am I doing otherwise. Like, we're doing a lot of physical training. I do things as a part of my physical training that keep me sharp mentally. But at the end of the day, like, you have to be, I think a part of being a pro these days is being capable of just jumping in and sorting it out in a hurry without being, like, adequately up to speed.
Breaking news, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure 3 is going to be made, JR. I know that'll make the two of us quite happy. Wild Stallions, hopefully there'll be a new soundtrack coming out here. We got a question from Facebook user who would appear to have created a profile, asked a question, and then happened to dive out. And I love the questions. So, what if IndyCar took away some of the in-car driver tools like the weight jacker? This would obviously make the cars more difficult to drive over a full stint, but would it improve the racing with more of a premium put into car setup? I mean, let's just stick to the weight jacker in 500. I mean, I know that for an Indy Lights race there, the setup that I came up with for my driver was so far off that he genuinely could not twist the weight jacker knob any further. He bottomed that sucker out. And thankfully, because we had the weight jacker and he was able to unscrew my screwed up setup, we were able to finish ninth. So yes, boys and girls, Marshall Pruett has a top 10 finish at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in Indy Lights. I won't tell you that there were only 8 cars entered, but regardless, I know how much, at worst case scenarios, boy, it can be a lifesaver if the setup is off. But even if it's really close, though, whether it is ambient changes throughout a 3-hour plus race, tire pressures, being adjusted and whatnot, what do you think life would be like without a weight jacker? And do you think it would spice up the racing? What would it do?
I don't. I mean, I think that it's maybe. I have never experienced. I've had the weight jacker or the roll bars, front, rear, both, one or the other, whatever. I've had them kind of save my ass, kind of to your point. Like, there are times when the car starts to get really bad that the one of those things, being able to go several clicks to the right or something, with the weight jacker, can be the thing that helps you get to an end of a stint. But they're not the, like, performance tuning tools that I think that I would lump a lot of other aids into. Like, they are things that help you as a driver get the most out of your setup for your style, I would say. They're not things that, like, just more generally add performance or make the car easier to drive. They really are tuning devices, not really like performance aids. I would lump like traction control or ABS, power steering. I don't know, things that are more like that. Even to some degree, the engine mapping that we have access to now is very limited as compared to other series on purpose, because of the way the ECU works. We can only get a certain number of kind of different engine maps, and we can't get it to where it's like traction control or stability control or any of that type of stuff. We can just kind of make the power delivery more or less aggressive, basically. But those are things, traction control, ABS, things like that, are genuine performance aids. Like, they make the car easier to drive. They make the car easier to operate all the way at its limit, because you're not having to manage the limit as much. You have these other tools that are stepping in and allowing for you to just run the thing flat out, and it kind of works out where the limit is, on its own, and deals with that. So I would say that the in-car kind of manual tuning devices are, for me, in a different category from that perspective. And as such, if you took those away, you would just see like a greater separation in, you'd see like those handful of guys that whereas they're able to use the tools to keep their car kind of close to the window through the end of a stint when the tires are really going off and they need to turn a front wing out. Those guys just like fall off the face of the map because they, can't stay in it. I think you'd see more of that than that, that somehow it would help separate drivers in any meaningful way.
All right, we're rounding turn 4 here, my man. A couple more to go, and then we are at the finish line. J.D. Ellis, this might end up, this is going to be a strong candidate for question of the week. Top 3 vintage cars you'd like to hop in and drive in anger, JR?
Oh, man, that is a great question. Okay, Porsche 91730. Gotta do it, right? Shoot, that's a great question. Well, I don't know. I'm tempted to be like 91730, Eagle Mark III, and like, Audi S1 Quattro Group B rally car or something.
That would
I don't know if those maybe like those are like late 80s, early 90s. I don't know if those qualify as super vintage. I think like, I have never actually driven any of the pre-wing, or, I've driven a bunch of the, sort of flat bottom winged F1 cars, like mid-70s, mid to late 70s F1 cars. I've never driven any of the kind of late 60s F1, any of the open wheel cars, whether they be like turbo offies or any of that stuff. I think that would like just be an interesting education in what those cars are like. But man, yeah, you got to go for Can-Am GTP.
I love it.
Group B. I'd love to drive one of those Audi, whatever the Audi 90 Trans Am cars.
Yeah, the Audi 200 Trans Am, Audi
200,
90 GTO. Yeah, you're singing the right tune here. Vincent Anderson says, "What was it like to test a Formula One car with Paul di Resta?" And I'll also ask about Paul di Resta as well.
Okay. It was amazing to drive the car. I mean, I was right out of Indy Lights the end of that year. The young driver test. So I did. Paul and I split 3 days. We each got half a day over 3 days at Jerez in Spain. I think that was actually Daniel Ricciardo's first time in the F1 car, maybe at that same test. I'm not 100% sure. Rossi was there in the BMW. So pretty good like crop of dudes. I came into it. We got selected among a group of drivers based on our sim time. So at that time, Force India had a technical relationship with McLaren Mercedes. They used the McLaren simulator. Force India, sort of cycled several guys. Like Neil Yanni was there, Karun Chandok, maybe some other. I don't. At the time, I don't remember knowing who the other guys were, but there was a handful of guys. Myself and di Resta were among them. I think basically they chose the two of us because we were sort of the quickest in the simulator at Jerez to be the two guys that did the young driver test. Particularly at that time, I had driven an IndyCar like once for a day at Sebring, but that was it.
Wow.
Went out there, just the sheer ability of the car. I mean, in 2009, heading into 2010, that was kind of like the year prior to them reformulating the rules to slow the cars back down, so they were really high aero grip cars at that point. Still very lightweight, no curves or any of that kind of stuff, so super nimble, change directions really quickly, high peak load capability, at that particular kind of moment in time of the regulations. I basically went into the thing knowing that I had never driven the car, I didn't know the track. I had not driven a GP2 car or done any of the European Formula stuff. So I was basically, my aim was just to leave knowing that I had experienced what the thing was like at its limit, basically. And that if I was able to parlay that into, really understanding the car and putting the whole thing together and ripping great laps and, being super impressive on the whole, awesome. But for me, it was really just about, knowing that I had reached its max capacity, cornering, braking, like doing those kinds of things. And the long and short of it is, over the duration of the test, I was certainly able to do that. I think I was in the high-speed sections of the track. That was where I was applying most of my focus at the time, and was super competitive in all of those areas. But as we all know, like, that's not where you make up all of your lap time, and it took me a while. It took me more time and kind of more effort than I was expecting, just to wrap my head around the difference in the car's behavior because of how different the tires were.
Yeah.
It really ended up coming down to, like, kind of being able to manipulate the corner entry, mid-corner in more technical parts of the track. And while I was kind of able to do that here and there, I was not, I didn't fully grasp, like, how to do it consistently. And it was kind of, the car, they're on 13-inch rims, so it's a much bigger sidewall. Sidewall is kind of a lot of the suspension of the car, basically. The car is super, roll-wise is super stiff. The tire deflects a lot, and so it was very strange. Getting out of the IndyCar, you have kind of a more direct feel for understeer, oversteer. It's like going from a radial tire to a bias ply or something. So Paul was great in those sections. Obviously, he ended up getting the gig for the third driver that next year, and then went on to be full-time at the team, basically until, I think, kind of just like some financial situations, moved him out, and he went to go do DTM. But an awesome experience. Great to work with the team. The engineer that I worked with there is Verstappen's engineer now, Sean Paul. He's awesome. No surprise, even just in a couple of days being there, that he's moved his way up the ladder, and cool experience that I'll always remember for sure.
I remember speaking to you right after you got back from that test, and you're like, "Whoa, that was amazing. That was also a lot." This was.
Well, even coming out of Indy Lights, like, there's one button on the steering wheel in an Indy Lights car. You've got, like, this goofy lever manual weight jacker, like, the roll bars, the Indy roll bars, like, get stuck and you can't move them for the rest of the race, so you forget about them. Getting into that thing, it's like, just getting the car out of the pit lane, getting the car back into the pit lane is like, twisting knobs, and you got to get it in the right thing, and,
push
blah, blah,
this,
blah,
turn
blah,
that.
like, it's all over the place. So, that even for sure, like, looking back on it, I would have spent more time trying to devise a way of being more prepared, frankly, just for that, like, spending more time at the shop, like, with the steering wheel, having somebody, I think they're used to the guys coming out of GP2 or coming over from DTM or whatever, and they're sort of used to managing a bunch of that kind of stuff. It was super fresh for me. That Indy Lights car in particular was, like, very analog. So, just kind of a crazy experience being over there a lot, like, trying to drink through a fire hose, but, the cars were awesome, and it was a lot of fun.
The one button on your Indy Lights steering wheel was actually a horn.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, we're going to round up here with 3 great questions. One from Jordan Darwin to start. JR, did you ever talk to Charlie Kimball about that last turn of the 2011 500? Should we tell folks that you guys actually meet up once a year in a cabin to reflect on that incident?
Cage fight.
Yes.
I don't know that we've ever really sat down and talked about it.
Unresolved issues. Ooh, someone's avoiding. Someone's deflecting.
We're both rookies. Like, I ended up, the thing that like caught me off guard at one point. We were both in a room. He was being interviewed about it, and I ended up finding out that, like, I thought, my assumption was that he was actually running out of gas at the time. Like, that was what I had kind of been told afterwards was the reason for why he was, going that slow. And ended up finding out that like his team had been telling him to slow down to try to go a lap down because they weren't going to make it around for another lap or something. So they needed to go a lap. They thought they needed to go a lap down to, like, I don't know, finish wherever they were at or something, which
wouldn't have to do another lap, which would certainly help from a fuel standpoint.
Well, but like if he's the last car to cross the finish line that's on the lead lap, then he could run out of gas that lap, and it's the same as being a lap down. So
yeah,
like that actually just doesn't make any sense. And he would, like he wouldn't have known that in the car. So I don't fault Charlie for like any of it. He's kind of just being, as a rookie. I mean, I remember I was there as a rookie too. Like there was some information that I wish that I had gotten that was different, or had been able to be a little bit more aware of what I needed to be looking out for, or whatever at that time. I'm sure if I put myself in his shoes, I mean, you're just being told kind of what you need to try to do, and it's the last lap, and everything's crazy and whatever. So I'm over it, but yeah, it's funny. It's kind of been something that hangs around a little bit, and obviously we've gone through plenty other kind of like races, and we've intersected plenty other times elsewhere. So no stress on my end, and hopefully something that we can right the ship. That's what we go show up at Indy every year since then for.
I love that. We got a positive spin to close there. All right, 2 to go. Daniel Kincaid actually had the most likes of all the questions that came in here, and it's technical. So, well, kind of technical. Daniel asks, how fast do you need to go at Indy before you are able to feel a setup change? Could you feel a difference of ride height change at an average lap speed of 215 or so? Or need to push it somewhat to get a feel for a setup change? And then the second question is, any guesses for trap speeds in qualifying boost? 245 mile an hour plus maybe, question mark. So question of setup change, if we're using ride height as the example, JR, would a lap at 95% be enough, or do you need to be 100% to give the team true feedback on what it did?
You gotta be with it. I mean, the cars are so dependent on, like if you're part throttle, pretty much, if you're out there out on the track in race trim during practice on your own, you gotta be flat out to know what the car is doing, basically. Unless you can't be, basically. Like unless either the aero package that you're on and or the tire deg that you're at doesn't allow for you to do that. But I would say, frankly, if that's the case, given the way the cars are right now, like they're momentum machines at Indy, you've got to be able to run the thing kind of in normalized, flat-out conditions to be able to know what the car is doing. Basing your judgments, even just off of like a high tire deg run, often you kind of get diminished returns on, even if you're able to be flat out, the car starts to do things that you don't like. If you're doing like 5-lap runs, and that's what you're going off of, that can even be really tough. So the direct answer is, I don't think you can ever really go off of like a 90% lap to make really good judgments. And a lot of that is just because the sensitivities at Indy are super high, so you have to know that you're heading in the right direction, that you're making a good change. What was the second part of the question?
Any guesses for trap speeds?
Trap speed.
Qualifying boost.
I'm going to say, maybe kind of like running up to the mid 230s, maybe. Last year to run 232, 231, 232, you're kind of, depending on, and like you get a little bit, you get like a difference in wind, you get a tailwind down the back straight, maybe this is different. But I think we were sort of tickling like 240 and some change. Just because the cars are more draggy this year, I just don't think you're going to see it be quite that high. So my guess would be kind of into the 230s.
Two guys from the San Francisco Bay Area. Trust us, we know all about drag. All right, we are going to go out with a final question from Ryan Casillas. He says, 2 for John Randall. What are your racing plans outside of the month of May this year, if you can legally tell us? And second, what is it like having Sage Karam as a teammate, and have you ever seen him with his shirt on?
I have not yet seen him with his shirt off.
Wow, so he's been holding out on you.
But, he's modeling and stuff.
He is. Great. He's a real, genuine model.
Yeah, I know.
He's the only driver who actually has a bearskin rug next to his car to stand on before he steps into the cockpit. Now that is impressive.
It's just part of his vibe.
Maybe you should turn up shirtless.
So far, it's been good. We have, I came out to Indy last week. He was allowed to do a refresher. So I just came out to observe, and I mentioned earlier in the pod, like, I think it would just be good to have he and Jeff Britton together, obviously, like, know what their car has been like in the past. So having that as the baseline for A to B from last year to this year, just for their car, so that I can then kind of like suss out, what I'm looking for and maybe how it compares to my stuff and the fact, my experience at ECR in the past and their setups and all that. I'm looking forward to it. And, I think in terms of the rest of my racing plans for the year, I've got some stuff that is actually, like, coming together that's going to be pretty cool. It's not, like, I'm kind of in the spot where, like, none of it's really finalized, but be bouncing around doing some different stuff, which was part of my aim. After the end of the year last year, I wanted to get a good deal together to run Indy, and obviously having Salesforce come on board and all that kind of stuff has been really awesome. But I was, after racing the full season IndyCar last year, I really didn't have any bandwidth to even look elsewhere. I've always loved the idea of having more of a mixed bag in terms of what my schedule is for the year, racing different kinds of stuff. I haven't done that much sports car racing, and haven't gotten into stock car ever in a like meaningful way. So been chasing down some stuff like that, and see how it shakes out. But looking forward to a fun rest of the season for sure.
JR Hildebrand, I owe you something, maybe espresso. You have gone way into overtime here to help us and share some fun tales and make us a wee bit smarter. So thank you for your generosity, brother.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, we are going to put this episode of the Week in IndyCar on the Marshall Pruett podcast, presented by Cooper Tires, to bed. And I will look forward to seeing you here shortly once we start getting some Grand Prix of Indianapolis underway, and then the month of May after that. So I will see you here shortly in Indianapolis, my man, and I'm sure we will be sitting down and having more podcast fun before the month is done.